Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're specifically going to talk about how we as dungeon masters warn people about villains, how we define villains, and then how we warn people about villains. So I watched an incredible film. It's called Nightmare Alley. It's by Guillermo del Toro, and it stars Bradley Cooper, Kate Blanchett, William Dafoe. It's unbelievably cast, and it's an amazing story. Spoilers for that in this, spoilers for Sopranos in this, spoilers for In Treatment in this, spoilers for, I think there's one more, Ozark in this. All right, so to talk about this theme, okay? So basically, this film, Nightmare Alley, does something incredibly unique, and in that it does an absolutely spectacular job of another instance, another exclamation point of a warning that Hollywood is shouting to the sky. They're shouting it as loud as they can, right? So let's talk about Hollywood and what they connect to. So one of the biggest things that Hollywood connects to is psychology, right? I love Hollywood because I love their movies, right? So I love their movies so much that I really, I really just fall in love with the work of multiple actors and actresses. And so an extension of that is I will listen to autobiographical audiobooks, right? And I've listened to probably 50 major, like, I'll give you this: Felicia Day, the major star from the mother from Gilmore Girls, Ron Perlman, and probably just a ton, right? Those are my favorites. That's why and they're all the same. Like, they're virtually all the same. They're like, I specifically arrived at Hollywood. It is an absolutely brutal dog-eat-dog world. And as soon as I had the money, I connected to a $500 to $1,000 an hour psychologist or psychiatrist, right? And so in their autobiographical audiobooks, without any exception, they all talk about the relationships to their psychologists, right? So and some of them will go to psychiatry, but I think so all right, so they all talk about their relationship to their psychologist, right? But then in their art, what they do is they say psychologists are deep, abiding, effective, predatory, horrifically powerful villains. It is an absolute drumbeat, right? And I think it's at a rate of about 9 to 10. I can't personally tell you a single positive portrayal of a single psychologist from any Hollywood project. But I'm going to list for you right now all the ones that are shouting to you: psychologists will take your trust, take your money, and deliver you shockingly horrific blows that are personal and damaging, right? Like, they just shout it in every single. So the movie I'm watching right now, it's called Nightmare Alley. It has a murdering criminal who happens to be a carny. A murdering criminal, those are terrible things. Being a carny is not necessarily a terrible thing, right? But they're like, here, look, the main character of this film is a murdering criminal carny, but he is dwarfed in villainy by a psychologist. And here's the psychologist. And here, can't you see how much more evil she is than a murdering criminal person who happens to be a carny? You're like, whoa, yeah, boy, that's a deep and abiding villain. Like, that person is incredibly effective at destroying lives and being outrageously dangerous, right? You see the same thing in Ozark. In Ozark, you see a psychologist who is treating both the husband and the wife and playing them against each other to get higher and higher rates, right? In Treatment, the main character in Treatment, the psychologist in Treatment, is an absolute monstrous villain, right? Who just does horrible things with his patients, right? There's a brand new Apple TV show that delves into this. It's just a non-stop, constant drumbeat, right? That Hollywood is saying, we use psychologists probably more than any other subset of American culture, and we are telling you with every story we make, with a few exceptions, that psychologists are profound, horrible, dangerous villains, right? And Nightmare Alley is just like, it does it the best, right? So I think what we need to learn, right, is just like Hollywood, we are storytellers, right? And we define, in every single Dungeons and Dragons game, we define who the heroes are. And by the way, Hollywood has almost completely given up on heroes. They didn't even bother with heroes. Like half the projects now are black rainbows, right? Where they're like, this is just a bunch of sets of villains, but they're in hierarchical status of villainy, right? Like, and maybe you could equate the least villainous as a hero, or like, but they will tell you, this villain is far worse than this villain, right? But we, coming from Gary Gygax's legacy, who was like, oh yes, there is good and there is evil. Here is a system to show you every color of morality, right? Like, shockingly clear. Good and evil exists. Heroes exist. Villains exist. And then saying from the very beginning, and it's carried through every edition of the game, you play heroes, you don't play villains. If you want to play a villain, Dungeons and Dragons ain't the place for you, right? Like, and it's been upheld in every single edition. No edition supports evil play. It gives a single, many of them explicitly say that you can't do this, and then even to the point today where 5th edition simply doesn't provision it in any meaningful way, right? And it does absolutely provision good and neutral aligned, right? So we define villain and hero, right? And so one of the things I think when I look at Nightmare Alley, it says to me, we have to be able to define a villain. And we are in a position where we will warn people. We will shout to them, this is a villain you need to watch out for. You're not expecting it, right? But this is villainous, right? And so one of the things, so really, I'm not giving you any direction on how or what to do. I'm reminding you that you will be doing it, right? Like, and I should say this, in a game where you are specifically aiming to impact more than the people at your table, or to improve the people at your table, which is all I talk about, right? In those types of games, you will define heroes, you will define villains, and you need to stop and think with every story you tell, who am I portraying as a hero? Who am I portraying as a villain? And what are the warnings I'm giving? We need to be very aware of this as dungeon masters, because it's a massive responsibility. And I will say, I thank you very much, Hollywood. I appreciate your warning about psychologists. I don't have the money to attach to psychologists the way, major stars do, right? And so I don't have all the data I want about psychology, right? But Hollywood is saying, we do have the money. We are connected to them. And in 9 out of 10 tales, we will tell you they are the most monstrous villains you will ever come across. Fascinating. I'm hearing what you're saying, Hollywood. I'm not 100%. I think I'm still, my opinion on psychology is still out, but I don't ignore data, right? And if you look at the pattern of what Hollywood is saying about psychology, and the pattern of the fact that Hollywood is massively connected to psychology, that is a major data point. And so I don't think we should ignore data. All that's my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think? How do you determine who you portray as a hero, who you portray as a villain, and how do you choose what villains you warn your players about? I'd love to hear in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.